This is a Fort Davis, Texas lost treasure story from a newspaper of 1897. It's titled, "Wouldn't Stay Buried." As you listen to this story, just remember the old saying, everything's bigger in Texas, even the tall tales. We're certain not everything in this story is true, namely the part about a dead body that kept jumping out of the grave and wouldn't stay buried, but we believe the part about the lost treasure is true. Besides, with a lost treasure story about a man with the name of Old Hog Wallins, you have a right to embellish the tale. Besides that, back in 1897, it could be a great joke giving some outlandish statements to a newspaper reporter, then be able to read it in the paper as a fact. The newspaper sure didn't mind. In fact, they loved it because it would probably sell more papers, so the more outlandish the better to them. But we're a little disappointed that they didn't see Old Hog turn in a zombie and start eating people. Just don't lose sight of the fact that the lost treasure part is probably real. Okay, let's get this story rolling. The strange inscription can be seen upon a great rock in a wild inhabited region of the mountains of western Texas. It is of course a puzzle to hunters who happen to run up against it while in pursuit of antelope, but there are yet living in the vicinity of Fort Davis a few old settlers capable of interpreting it. Some of these gray-haired pioneers were well acquainted with the deceased individual whose peculiar death and character some bold artist attempted to perpetuate upon the internal rock. Mr. Hog Wallins was certainly a very extraordinary man, and during his short career in the mountains of western Texas, his conduct furnished those who knew him best with a subject for reflection and discussion that never ceased to be interesting. Old Uncle Bob Rollins, who lived for several years not far from the Wallins Ranch, says that the proprietor of that slice of real estate was one of the meanest and, at the same time, one of the strangest characters that ever lived. I don't know, he says, who wrote his epitaph on the rocks, but the artist only hinted at the truth. He died in a storm, while he was standing on his feet, cursing like a pirate. It is supposed that he was killed by a thunderbolt. A sheep herder who witnessed the horrible scene says that the incarnate devil cursed God for sending a storm to kill a sheep, and cursed the earth for not furnishing grass, and swore he would not lie in Texas soil. Punishment pursued his carcass after his death. For 3 times we buried him, and 3 times the grave opened and threw the decaying body of the monster out to the howling wolves. It would not stay buried. Texas earth would not hold its carcass. Mortal ears never listened to a stranger's story, but Cal Whittington, Tola Thanet, and Milky Sands, all reliable cattlemen of the Rio Grande country, corroborate the statement of Uncle Bob Rollins, and they added each equally as startling and incredible. Hog Wallace was a name given to the man by the cowboys after they become somewhat familiar with his character. His real name was John Wallace, and he claimed to have come to Texas direct from Liverpool. When the cattlemen and cowboys in the vicinity heard of the death of the strange character, they went to the place in the mountains where his body was lying for the purpose of giving the deceased a decent burial. The grave was not easy to dig in the hard mountain soil. It was not easily done, and it was some time after sundown when the last act in a sad rite had been performed. Some of the cowboys had lit a fire a short distance from the grave and prepared a little repast for the party. The horses were already picketed in good grass, and after lighting cigarettes, they concluded to spread their blankets under the trees and remain until morning. About midnight there was a low rumbling sound that caused every man to spring to his feet. The trees were swaying, the horses were staggering, and the earth was trembling so violently that the frightened cattle were thrown to their knees. While endeavoring to regain their senses, someone shouted, "Look, look," at the same time pointing toward the grave. All eyes followed the man's wild gesture, and every man present is unto this day ready to maintain upon his oath that the grave opened, and that the body of the dead man shot high in the air. It struck the earth upon its feet, says Mr. Whittington, and as certain as I stand here it staggered upright 2 or 3 steps toward our camp and fell on its face. Never did mortal man witness a more horrible sight. We could see the glaring eyeballs and the white teeth, while the long arms swung about wildly. After the shock had passed, the cattlemen mounted their horses and rode to the cabin of a Mexican herder who had been in the employ of the dead man. Here old man Dolan, who was a graduate of Trinity College, Dublin, made an attempt to explain the strange scene that they had witnessed. Mr. Dolan had studied medicine in Paris, and he was also something of a philosopher, "Man," said he, "is a creature of habit. Put a corpse on its feet and it will walk." The Greeks were well acquainted with the startling fact, and a great Frenchmen were not discovering anything when they demonstrated by actual experiment. "We have just witnessed an earthquake," added the wise Irishman, "and in its violence the grave was opened and the dead man was thrown upon his feet. Being a creature of habit, it doubtless staggered a step or two before it fell." The cowboys shook their heads and puffed their cigarettes in silence until daylight. With the rising sun they regained their courage, and being somewhat ashamed of their hurried flight, they concluded to return to their camp and investigate the strange occurrence of the previous night. They found the shallow grave open and the corpse lying on its face, some 10 feet away. "Never," said one who was present, "did mortals ever wear on their face such a look of bewilderment and consternation." Scarcely a word was spoken while they dragged the body back to the open grave and once more covered it with that Texas soil which old Hog Wallins had cursed and swore he would not lie dead in. The cattlemen returned to their various ranches, never dreaming that they had not witnessed the end of the strange affair. On the very next morning a Mexican galloped up to the house of Mr. Thanet and shouted, "The grave won't hold him! He is out! He is loose again!" Mr. Thanet could hardly believe the frightened man's story, but he collected 4 or 5 of his neighbors and returned to the mountains for the purpose of interring, for the 3rd time, the remains of the man who had swore while living that he would not lie dead in Texas soil. They found the body lying only a few feet from the open grave. There was a great yawning crack in the earth. The grave made a part of this crack, which extended for considerable distance along the side of the mountain. After looking for some moments at this mound in the earth, evidently made by a recent seismic convulsion, the cattlemen concluded that it was useless to try to make Texas soil contain the body of a man who had cursed it. They induced the Mexican to drag the now hideous and repulsive object to a deep gulch, and then in silence they occupied a few moments in rolling rocks and logs upon it. People were only given 2 days and nights in which to wonder whether or not they would ever hear again of the body of Hog Wallins. A terrible storm swept over the mountains. It never occurred to anyone that a volume of water of sufficient potency to move the corpse from beneath the rocks and logs would pour through the gulch, but something of that kind must have happened. 2 cowboys found the loathsome object covered with mud lying against a great rock on the side of the canyon in the mountains. These same cowboys had only a few days before helped pile rocks and logs upon the body of Hog Wallins in this same gulch, a few hundred yards above the place where they were now standing, and one of them said, "Since the earth he cursed will not hold him, let us see if fire will devour him." After covering the hideous object with grass and brush, they touched a match to the heap and then galloped away. It is not known who carved their remarkable inscription on the great rock, which was blackened by the flames of the funeral pyre, which is supposed to have been a cowboy well known in the cattle camps of the Rio Grande by the rather poisonous-sounding sobriquet of Vinegar Room. The old cabin in which the man Wallace lived is still standing, and the Mexicans in the neighborhood declare that his ghost can be seen prowling about there almost any night. The whole face of the country about the house has been dug up by treasure hunters, who firmly believe that the strange character left a large sum of gold buried somewhere near his residence. It is well known that he was a very rich man, but no one in this country ever became in the least familiar with him, and it is not known whether he shipped his gold to Europe or buried it. He came to Texas with the Sunset Railroad and attracted attention from the beginning from the fact that he always wore a great cavalry saber strapped to his belt. He was an ugly, mean, selfish, gruff man whom everyone avoided. Among the articles of his baggage unloaded at the depot were a pair of andirons, called dog irons in Texas, that attracted the attention of the whole country. They were 6 feet high, and the upright pieces for holding the wood in the fireplace were made of solid brass, varnished with gold. The knobs at the top were pure gold. These monstrous fixtures, the like of which had never before been seen in Texas, weighed over 1,000 pounds. He brought with him from Europe a whole arsenal of firearms, consisting of 2 brass cannon and swords, guns and pistols of almost every make. Several wagon loads of books were hauled to his cabin in the mountains. He lived on very familiar terms with the Mexicans and Indians, but it was seldom that he engaged in conversation with an American. He made several trips to Europe, and upon one occasion he took an old Mexican woman with him. This old woman said that he had large sums of gold in his room in Liverpool, and that he once spent a whole evening counting the gold. These Mexicans who lived about him were all terrorized by him, and he was no sooner dead than his effects disappeared. They now accuse him of having committed many revolting crimes. They firmly believe that he kept a large sum of gold buried somewhere about his cabin, but the treasures of the Yukon would not induce one of them to go near the place after sunset. On the day of his death, a fierce northerner was sweeping over the mountains. An old hog went out to look after a band of sheep. He found a herder trying to drive the flock towards shelter, but with the cold rain and sleet beating in their faces, they were unwilling. Old Wallace, after vainly endeavoring to make them move, began to curse the herder and threatened to shoot him. He raved and threw his hat on the ground and stamped it, storming at everything. He finally cursed God and cursed Texas, swearing that he would not lie dead in the soil of such an infernal land. The Mexican felt the earth tremble, and he was blinded by a flash of flame. When he looked around, Hog Wallins was lying sprawling on the rocks. White foam was streaming from his lips, yet quivering with rage and blasphemy. This is a lost treasure story out of Grapeville Station, Pennsylvania, near Greensburg, from a newspaper article dated June 15, 1921. The article headline is, "Long Buried Gold." Grapeville Station, just west of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, furnished a sensation in the form of hidden treasure when Thomas Miller dug up an old tin can containing 14 $20 gold pieces and 3 $10 gold pieces. It is said that about 30 years ago, when Philip Bricker of Grapeville died, he was supposed to have left considerable money, but it was not found by his relatives. Lately, the property was sold to Miller, and when he was raising several buildings, he struck the prize and found the gold. It is suspected that there are more gold pieces on the property. On October 25, 1903, a newspaper ran the story of the Vinton brothers' lost treasure. A secret of many years, known only to Dwight Vinton and his brother Ablow, was revealed today by Dwight, who told of $6,000 in gold buried in the woods near his Dudley home. Ablow returned from the West in 1870, and for safekeeping, buried his treasure in unfrequented woods near his home. Although they dug many days and nights together, they never unearthed the treasure. Dwight Vinton, who is now over 80 years, says he does not expect to live long and wants the world to know of the buried wealth. Ablow died 4 years ago. A side note here. This newspaper is faded so bad that it's hard to tell if Dwight's brother's name is Ablow or Abiel. It's spelled either A-B-L-A-L or A-B-I-A-L. There is still gold that was not accounted for. Okay, on with the story. Last summer, Joseph Wasson, a pioneer of the Delano country, north of here, died, and in his last moments was unable to tell where he buried his money. He was known to be quite wealthy, but his brother John, who administered the estate, searched in vain for the money until one day recently he dug under a cache of $2,000 in gold and $200, or a cache of $0 in gold and $200 or $300 of smaller denominations. It's suspected that more gold remains buried on the place, but further search has been in vain. And that's the story. There are no typos on our part. That's the way the article reads.